Recently, I talked about the story of Abraham and Isaac, and I gave my read, which is that Abraham does not pass the test. When asked to murder his own son, the correct response is not yes, sir. The correct response is to argue with God, just the way that Abraham argued with God over the fate of Sodom. I don't think this is a story about a father who passes the test. I think it's a story about a father who fails and a God who then steps in to stop the cycle of violence that we humans have created and perpetuated all along. So when God announces the destruction of Sodom, Abraham is there to argue with God. He pushes back, he pleads for justice. He actually says to God, "Will not the judge of all the earth do what is right?" And yet when God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, he's silent, he doesn't question it, he doesn't resist. It's like he defaults back into this small, petty imagination of a vindictive God. And in that moment, God has to step in to fix things. But one of the pushbacks to this is, well, wasn't Isaac a type of Christ? That type is sort of this technical word that we use that says that story points us toward the story of Christ, the cross, the sacrifice of Jesus. Aren't we losing that if we don't understand Abraham's response as faithful? Well, actually, no. I think this actually becomes an even stronger typology of what we see in the cross. Isaac isn't a type of Christ because Abraham was willing to kill him. Isaac is a type of Christ because God intervenes at the climactic moment. Isaac does not show us the child that God will sacrifice. Isaac shows us the child for whom God says, no, this is not who I am, this is not what I want. And the whole point of that story is that God rejects the idea of child sacrifice forever. This story burns into the Hebrew imagination that this is a line we cannot cross. No matter what other nations tell us, no matter what other gods demand, our God is different. So yes, Isaac prefigures Jesus, not because God demands sacrifice, but because God will interrupt it. So here's where we often go wrong. We imagine that God is the one who will sacrifice Jesus just the way that Abraham is asked to sacrifice Isaac, but that has a few problems with it. One is it breaks the Trinity into pieces. It bifurcates God. Now, Jesus is God. The Father, Son, and Spirit share one will, one nature, one love. This is what we mean when we say Trinity. So the cross is not God sacrificing Jesus. The cross is not God doing violence to Jesus. The cross is God in Jesus stepping into the violence that we do. We are the ones sacrificing Jesus. We are the ones scapegoating him. We are the one making him a political and a religious casualty to our imagination. God then absorbs the violence in the cross, doesn't do the violence to Jesus. And all of a sudden then, I think we start to see some really powerful parallels between this interpretation of the Isaac-Abraham story I've presented and our imagination of what's happening on the cross. If Isaac is the story that stops child sacrifice, then Jesus is the story that stops all sacrifice. The cross is not God demanding blood any more than the story of Isaac was God demanding child sacrifice. The cross is God allowing us to expose our own addiction to violence. We kill an innocent man and we call it justice. We murder the Prince of Peace and we call it God's will. And what does God do then? God raises Jesus from the dead. Resurrection is God's verdict on our violence. This man is innocent. Your violence is not justice. It's the turning point in history, the moment sacrifice is revealed, exposed, and undone. Remember, Jesus on the cross says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do." They think they are enacting political justice. What they are doing is perpetuating scapegoating violence that casts out one and makes them feel justified for themselves. God, in that moment, absorbs that violence to put an end to it all. That's what God is doing in the story of Abraham and Isaac. God is ending child sacrifice. On the cross, God is ending sacrifice for good. So no, Abraham doesn't pass the test. God does. And we don't pass the test in the cross. God does. Isaac doesn't foreshadow divine violence. He foreshadows divine mercy. And Jesus doesn't die because God needed a sacrifice in order to forgive. Jesus dies because we needed all of that. And we needed God to show us that sacrifice was never God's way. In Isaac, God stops the knife, ends child sacrifice. In Jesus, God stops sacrificial violence forever, frees us from the need for it, frees us from our ability to scapegoat, sacrifice, cast out another, and then call it good. Because we see Jesus' innocence, and finally our eyes are opened to all of the violence that we are doing all of the time to each other. And then, of course, in Jesus' resurrection, we see that, God has been in this all along. Jesus was God, putting an end to it all, changing the story and pointing us forward in a new direction, no longer dependent on sacrifice to know that we're forgiven, no longer dependent on violence to justify ourselves. So Abraham and Isaac are a type. They are prefiguring, they are pointing us to the cross to say something new is happening and God is changing history. But it's just not the way that we think it is. Because God is not consumed, God is not in love with sacrificial violence. God intends to put an end to it all, slowly, step by step, as God reveals God's self to us. And in Jesus, in the cross and in the resurrection, we see God clearly, exactly, perfectly represented for the first time in history.